In the dusty copper mines of Arizona Territory, where children's dreams go to die, 12-year-old Samuel worked 16-hour shifts with hands too small for the tools he carried. His world was darkness, danger, and the constant fear of cave-ins that claimed young lives weekly. Then one scorching afternoon, a stranger in expensive boots and a weathered hat walked into the mine office with cash in hand and fire in his eyes. Jack Morrison wasn't just any cowboy. He owned the largest ranch in 3 counties, but wealth hadn't hardened his heart. When he saw Samuel's bruised fingers and hollow eyes, something stirred deep within him. A paternal instinct he'd buried. After losing his own son years before, what started as a simple act of kindness would soon become the fight of his life. But what happens when Samuel's dangerous past refuses to stay buried? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the copper mines outside Bisbee, casting long shadows across the scarred earth where men and boys alike disappeared into the belly of the mountain each dawn. The year was 1885, and fortunes were being carved from stone by those brave enough or desperate enough to descend into the darkness. Jack Morrison had never intended to visit the mines that day. His business lay in cattle and land, vast stretches of desert and grassland that stretched beyond the horizon under the endless blue sky. At 52, he commanded respect from the Ranchers Association to the territorial governor's office. His Morrison Ranch encompassed nearly 30,000 acres of prime grazing land, watered by 3 natural springs and protected by canyon walls that seemed carved by God's own hand. But grief had a way of changing a man's path. The faded daguerreotype in his vest pocket told the story he carried everywhere, a family portrait taken 5 years earlier in Tucson's finest photography studio. His wife Eleanor sat primly in her Sunday dress, her gentle eyes reflecting the kindness that had first captured his heart. Beside her stood their son Thomas, barely 7 years old, wearing his first pair of real boots and grinning with the infectious joy that had filled their ranch house with laughter. Both were gone now, claimed by the fever that swept through the territory in the winter of 1880. Eleanor had nursed Thomas through his illness, then succumbed herself just days after they laid the boy to rest in the small cemetery behind the ranch's chapel. Jack had built that chapel with his own hands during their courtship, never imagining it would hold such sorrow. The mine foreman, a weathered man named Hutchins, who reeked of tobacco and desperation, had been all too eager to discuss business when Jack arrived with his proposal. Stories had reached the ranchers about the mining company's treatment of workers, particularly the children, who labored in conditions that would shame any decent man. Jack had come with cash and questions, intending to make some kind of difference, though he wasn't entirely sure what form that difference might take. "Got plenty of strong boys, Mr. Morrison," Hutchins had said, his gold teeth glinting in the lamplight of the cramped office. "Course they ain't exactly available for regular ranch work, if you catch my meaning." Jack had caught his meaning all too well. The boys weren't employees. They were property, sold into labor by families too poor or too cruel to care for them properly. The legal fiction was thin, but effective in a territory where law enforcement remained sparse and corruption ran deep as any mine shaft. "I'd like to see the working conditions," Jack had said simply, placing a substantial roll of bills on the scarred wooden desk between them. Samuel had been operating a hand-cranked ore car when Jack first saw him, his small frame dwarfed by the heavy machinery. The boy's shirt hung in tatters, barely covering a back crisscrossed with old scars. His hands, which should have been holding school books or fishing poles, instead gripped tools meant for grown men. When their eyes met across the dusty mine floor, Jack saw something that stopped his heart, a quiet dignity that reminded him painfully of his own lost son. The boy couldn't have weighed more than 70 pounds, yet he worked with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had learned that survival meant never showing weakness His dark hair was matted with dust and sweat, his feet bare and cut from the rocky mine floor. But it was his eyes that sealed Jack's decision, hollow with exhaustion, yet still holding a spark of intelligence that no amount of cruelty had managed to extinguish. "That one," Jack had said to Hutchins, pointing toward Samuel. "What's his situation? Came to us about 8 months back. Family couldn't feed him, signed the papers proper. He's a good worker, quiet, doesn't cause trouble like some of them do." Hutchins spat a stream of tobacco juice into a dented spittoon. "Course, he's got another 4 years on his contract." Jack had reached into his coat and pulled out more money than most men in the territory saw in a year. "I'm buying out his contract. Today." The transaction had been completed with ruthless efficiency. Papers were signed, money changed hands, and within an hour Samuel found himself sitting beside Jack Morrison in a buckboard wagon, heading away from the only life he could remember, toward an uncertain future. The boy hadn't spoken during the first hour of their journey. He sat rigidly upright, his small hands folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, as if expecting this miraculous turn of events to evaporate like a desert mirage. Jack respected his silence, understanding that trust would be earned slowly, if at all. The Morrison ranch revealed itself gradually as they crested a low hill, the main house coming into view first, a sprawling adobe structure with a red tile roof and deep verandas that offered refuge from the desert heat. Cottonwood trees, fed by underground springs, provided blessed shade around the house and outbuildings. Cattle grazed in distant pastures, their brown and white hides visible against the green of carefully maintained grassland. "This is home," Jack said quietly as they approached the house. It was the first time he'd used that word since Eleanor. "And Thomas died." Samuel's eyes widened as he took in the sight of the ranch. A vegetable garden flourished near the kitchen, tended by careful hands and protected by a fence of mesquite wood. Horses moved lazily in a nearby corral, their coats gleaming with health and proper care. The buildings were well maintained, painted, white with green trim, suggesting prosperity without ostentation. Maria Consuela emerged from the kitchen as the wagon drew to a halt, wiping her hands on her apron. She had been Eleanor's closest friend and had stayed on after the family's tragedy, partly from loyalty and partly because she knew Jack needed looking after, though he'd never admit it. Her dark eyes immediately assessed the thin boy beside her employer, and Jack saw understanding pass across her weathered features. "Señora Consuela," Jack said formally, helping Samuel down from the wagon. "I'd like you to meet Samuel. He'll be staying with us." Maria stepped forward with the natural grace that had made her invaluable to Eleanor's household. "Welcome, mijo," she said gently, using the Spanish endearment that meant, "my son. You look hungry. When did you last have a proper meal?" Samuel glanced uncertainly at Jack before answering in a voice barely above a whisper. "I don't rightly remember, ma'am." "Then we fix that first thing," Maria declared, already moving toward the kitchen. "You come with me, Samuel. We get you cleaned up and fed proper." Old Pete Williams emerged from the barn, his bow-legged walk marking him as a man who'd spent his life in the saddle. At 68, he served as Jack's foreman, a position he'd held for nearly 15 years. His weathered face had seen every kind of hardship the frontier could offer, but his eyes remained kind behind the permanent squint. "Earned from decades under the desert sun." "Boss," Pete nodded to Jack, then looked curiously at Samuel. "This the boy you went to fetch?" "This is Samuel," Jack confirmed. "He'll be learning the ranch business." Pete extended a gnarled hand to the boy. "Pleased to meet you, son. You ever work with horses?" Samuel shook his head, still overwhelmed by the kindness he was encountering. "No, sir. Just the mines." "Well, horses are a damn sight better company than rocks," Pete said with a chuckle. "Begging your pardon for the language, boy. We'll start you easy, maybe with old Buttercup there. She's gentle as a lamb and twice as patient." That first evening, as Samuel sat at the kitchen table with more food before him than he'd seen in months, Jack watched from the doorway and felt something shift in his chest. The boy ate carefully, as if afraid the meal might be snatched away, but his eyes darted around the warm kitchen with something approaching wonder. Maria had prepared his favorite meal, beef stew, thick with vegetables from her garden, fresh bread, still warm from the oven, and milk so rich it left a white moustache on Samuel's upper lip. The boy had submitted to a thorough scrubbing in the washhouse, emerging pink-cheeked and dressed in some of Thomas's old clothes that Maria had carefully preserved. "Where will I sleep?" Samuel asked quietly, when his hunger was finally satisfied. Jack had been dreading this question. Thomas's room remained exactly as his son had left it, preserved like a shrine to a future that would never come. But looking at Samuel, clean, fed, and beginning to show the first tentative signs of hope, Jack made a decision that surprised even himself. "Upstairs," he said. "Second door on the right. Maria's made it ready for you." The boy's eyes filled. With tears he refused to shed. "Thank you, Mr. Morrison. I'll work hard, I promise. I'll earn my keep." "I know you will, son," Jack replied, the endearment slipping out naturally, "but for now you just worry about being a boy again." As Samuel climbed the stairs to his new room, to Thomas's room, Jack felt Eleanor's presence as strongly as if she were standing beside him. He could almost hear her voice, warm with approval. "You done good, Jack Morrison. You done real good." 3 months had passed since Samuel's arrival at the Morrison Ranch, and the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. The hollow-eyed, frightened child who had sat rigid in the buckboard wagon had given way to a boy who laughed at old Pete's stories, helped Maria tend her garden, and rode Buttercup around the corral with growing confidence. The scars on his back had faded to thin white lines, testimony to his past, but no longer the angry red reminders of daily brutality. His hands, once cracked and bleeding from handling mining tools, had softened with proper care and the gentler work of ranch life. Most remarkably, he had begun to fill out, his frame no longer skeletal, but showing the promise of the strong young man he might become. Jack found himself looking forward to mornings in a way he hadn't since Eleanor and Thomas died. Samuel would appear at the kitchen table just as the sun painted the eastern mountains gold, his hair still damp from washing, his eyes bright with anticipation for the day ahead. The boy had proven himself eager to learn everything about ranch life, from mending fences to reading the weather in cloud formations. "Pa," Samuel had said one evening, as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of orange and purple. The word had slipped out naturally, unconsciously, and both of them had frozen at the sound of it. Jack's throat had tightened with emotion. "Say that again, son." "Pa," Samuel repeated, this time deliberately, his voice soft but certain. Is that all right?" "More than all right," Jack had replied, his voice thick with feeling. "It's perfect." That conversation had taken place just a week ago, and since then, Samuel had used the word with increasing frequency and confidence. Jack had never imagined that such a simple word could heal wounds he thought would never mend. But somehow, this remarkable boy had managed to reach into the darkest corners of his grief and kindle new light there. The morning that changed everything started like any other. Samuel helped Maria gather eggs from the henhouse, while Jack and old Pete discussed plans for expanding the herd. The boy had developed a particular fondness for the chickens, naming each one and carrying on conversations with them that made Maria smile and shake her head in fond exasperation. "Señorita Carmela laid 3 eggs today," Samuel announced proudly as he entered the kitchen with his basket. "And Doña Esperanza finally forgave me for accidentally stepping on her tail yesterday. That chicken holds grudges longer than some people I know." Maria laughed, taking the basket from him. "You wash up now. Breakfast is almost ready." It was old Pete who first noticed the rider approaching from the east, his experienced eyes spotting the dust cloud long before anyone else. "Boss?" he called from the corral, his voice carrying a note of concern. "Got company coming? Riding hard." Jack emerged from the barn, shading his eyes against the morning sun. The rider was pushing his horse at a pace that suggested urgency, and as he drew closer, Jack recognized him as Tommy Garrett, who worked at the telegraph office in town. "Mr. Morrison!" Tommy called out as he reined in his lathered horse. "Got a message for you, sir. Came in on the wire from Phoenix this morning." Jack accepted the telegram with growing unease. In his experience, nothing good ever came by urgent wire. He unfolded the yellow paper and read the brief message, his face darkening with each word. "What is it, Pa?" Samuel asked, appearing at Jack's elbow with the unconscious trust that had developed between them. Jack looked down at the boy, his boy, and felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Nothing to worry about, son. Just business." But the telegram told a different story entirely. It was from a lawyer in Phoenix, warning that parties interested in Samuel's whereabouts had been making inquiries. Someone was looking for the boy, and they weren't giving up easily. The second message arrived that afternoon, this one not through official channels, but carried by a drifter who claimed to have been paid $5 to deliver it personally to Jack Morrison. This message was shorter, written in crude handwriting on coarse paper, but its meaning was crystal clear. "Morrison, the boy belongs to us. We know where he is. Return him or face consequences. You have 1 week." There was no signature, but Jack didn't need one. He knew exactly who had sent it. That evening, after Samuel had gone to bed, Jack called Maria and old Pete into his study. The room was lined with books that Eleanor had loved, and her presence still seemed to linger among the leather-bound volumes and carefully tended plants. Jack closed the door and showed them both messages. "Dios mío," Maria whispered, crossing herself. "They want to take our boy back to that terrible place over my dead body," old Pete growled, his weathered hands clenching into fists. "That child's been through enough hell for one lifetime." "The legal situation is complicated," Jack said grimly. "I paid for his contract, but these people are claiming I don't have proper custody. They're saying the original papers weren't filed incorrectly." "What does that mean?" Maria asked, though her expression suggested she already feared the answer. "It means they might have legal standing to take him back," Jack admitted. "At least until a proper court can sort it out. And in the meantime," he didn't need to finish the sentence. They all knew what kind of life Samuel would face if he were forced to return to the mines. The boy had shared enough stories during his recovery to paint a clear picture of the brutality and desperation that defined that world. "What do we do?" old Pete asked. Jack was quiet for a long moment, staring at the threatening letter. Finally, he looked up at his two oldest friends. "We protect him, whatever it takes." The next morning, Samuel sensed immediately that something had changed. The adults were too careful around him, their smiles too bright, their conversations, and too quick to shift when he entered a room. He was 12 years old, but life in the mines had taught him to read danger in adult faces with uncanny accuracy. "Pa," he said as they worked together repairing a section of fence, "are you in some kind of trouble?" Jack paused in his hammering, considering how much truth the boy could handle. "Nothing I can't manage, son, but I want you to stay close to the house for a while. No riding out to the far pastures by yourself." Samuel's eyes widened with understanding. "It's about me, isn't it? Someone wants me to go back." The directness of the question caught Jack off guard. He'd forgotten how perceptive Samuel could be, how quickly he'd learned to read the subtle signs of adult worry. There was no point in lying to him. "Yes," Jack said simply. "But I want you to understand something, Samuel. No one is taking you anywhere. This is your home now, and I'll fight heaven and hell to keep it that way." The boy was quiet for a moment, processing this information with the seriousness of someone much older. What if they come with the law? What if they have papers? "Let's say I have to go back? Then we'll get better papers," Jack said firmly. "I've got friends in Phoenix, people who owe me favors. We'll make this legal and proper, whatever it takes." But even as he spoke the words, Jack felt a cold certainty settling in his bones. The men who wanted Samuel back wouldn't be deterred by legal niceties. They had too much invested in keeping. their operation running, and they couldn't afford to let word spread that children could simply be rescued from their contracts. They would come for Samuel, and when they did, it wouldn't be with lawyers and paperwork. That night, as Samuel lay in his bed, Thomas's bed, staring at the ceiling, he made a decision that would have surprised the adults who were trying so hard to protect him. He wasn't going to hide behind Jack's strength anymore. He wasn't going to be the helpless victim who needed rescuing. If they wanted him back, they would have to fight for him. And Samuel had learned more about fighting during his months in the mines than any child should ever have to know. The threatening letter lay on Jack's desk like a coiled snake, its crude words a promise of violence to come. Outside, the desert wind whispered through the cottonwood trees, carrying with it the scent of distant storms. Change was coming to the Morrison Ranch, and everyone could feel it in the air. Samuel's dangerous past had finally caught up with them, and the peaceful months of healing and hope were about to be tested in ways none of them could imagine. In 7 days, their world would be turned upside down. But for now, in the quiet hours before dawn, a man and a boy slept under the same roof, bound together by something stronger than blood. The fierce love of family chosen rather than given, and the determination to protect it at any cost. The morning sun cast long shadows across the main street of Bisbee, as Jack Morrison guided his horse toward the whitewashed building that housed the town's legal offices. His Winchester rifle rested in its scabbard, a decision that hadn't gone unnoticed by the townspeople who watched his passage with curious eyes. In all his years of conducting business in town, Jack Morrison had never before felt the need to come armed. The lawyer's office occupied the second floor above Hendrick's Mercantile, accessible by a narrow staircase that creaked under Jack's boots. William Ashford had been practicing law in the territory for nearly a decade, and his reputation for honesty had made him invaluable to ranchers dealing with land disputes and business contracts. Jack hoped that reputation extended to more dangerous matters. "Mr. Morrison," Ashford said, rising from behind his cluttered desk as Jack entered. He was a thin man with prematurely grey hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "I received your message. Please, sit down." Jack removed his hat and took the offered chair, noting how Ashford's gaze lingered on the rifle. "I need legal advice, Will, about adoption procedures and custody rights." "Ah," Ashford said, settling back into his chair. "This concerns the boy you took from the mines, I assume. Word travels fast in a small town. Samuel's been with me for 3 months now. I want to make it official, legal, adopt him proper." Jack leaned forward in his chair. "What do I need to do?" Ashford pulled out a leather-bound book and flipped through several pages. "Well, that depends on the circumstances of his original placement. Do you have the papers from the mining company?" Jack produced the documents he'd received when purchasing Samuel's contract. Ashford studied them carefully, his frown deepening as he read. Finally, he set the papers aside and removed his spectacles, cleaning them with careful precision. "Jack, I'm afraid there may be complications. These papers were filed with the territorial authority, but they reference a prior custody arrangement that isn't fully documented here. If the boy has living relatives who claim guardianship, the people who sold him to the mines aren't his relatives," Jack said flatly. "The boys told me enough about his situation to know that much." "What exactly has he told you?" Jack hesitated. Samuel had shared fragments of his story during quiet moments, pieces of a puzzle that painted a disturbing picture. He remembers his parents, real parents, not the people who signed him over to the mining company. Says they died when he was younger, and then some folks claimed to be family, took him in for a while before selling him off. Ashford made notes on a legal pad. "That suggests potential fraud in the original custody papers. If we could prove the boy was illegally placed with the mining company," he trailed off, shaking his head, "but proving it would require witnesses, documentation, things that might not exist anymore. What about the adoption? Can I file papers regardless?" You can file them, yes. But if someone contests the adoption with prior legal claim, it could tie things up in territorial court for months, maybe years. Ashford's expression was sympathetic but realistic. And in the meantime, any party with standing could potentially petition for the boys' return to their custody. Jack felt his jaw tighten. You're saying they could take him back while we're fighting it in court? I'm saying the law isn't always as clear-cut as we'd like it to be, especially when it comes to minors in disputed custody situations. A commotion from the street below interrupted their conversation. Jack moved to the window and looked down to see Sheriff Briggs talking to 3 men on horseback. Even from the second floor, Jack could tell these weren't local cowboys or traveling merchants. They sat their horses with the easy confidence of men accustomed to violence, and their clothes suggested they had money behind them. "Will," Jack said quietly, "come take a look at this." Ashford joined him at the window, and Jack heard the lawyer's sharp intake of breath. The man talking to Sheriff Briggs, that's Silas Kane. He's the supervisor at the Copper Crown Mining Company. "And the other 2? I don't know them personally, but I'd guess they're what you might call private security. Kane's been known to employ such men when dealing with difficult situations." Jack watched as Kane gestured toward the edge of town, in the direction of the Morrison Ranch. The conversation was too distant to overhear, but the meaning was clear enough. They were planning something, and Sheriff Briggs was nodding along with whatever Kane was telling him. "Will, I need you to file those adoption papers today. Whatever complications might arise, I want it on record that I'm claiming legal guardianship of Samuel." "Jack, I have to advise you that filing those papers might actually escalate the situation. If Kane has legal standing, let him try to prove it in court," Jack interrupted. "In the meantime, I'll have documentation showing my intent to provide. For the boys' welfare." Ashford studied his friend's face for a long moment. "This isn't just about legal guardianship anymore, is it? You're expecting trouble." "I'm preparing for it," Jack corrected. "There's a difference." On the ride back to the ranch, Jack's mind turned over the implications of what he'd seen in town. Kane's presence meant the threats weren't idle. They were moving from intimidation to action. The fact that Sheriff Briggs had been so receptive to Kane's conversation suggested the corruption ran deeper than Jack had hoped. He took a detour on the way home, stopping at the small spread owned by Carlos Mendoza, a neighbor who ran cattle on land adjacent to the Morrison Ranch. Carlos had served in the territorial militia and could be counted on for both discretion and backbone. "Jack," Carlos called out as he approached the house. "Good to see you, amigo. What brings you out this way?" "Trouble, most likely," Jack said, dismounting. "Mind if we talk privately?" They walked away from the house toward a grove of mesquite trees that provided both shade and privacy. Jack explained the situation as succinctly as possible, watching Carlos's expression grow increasingly grim. "These mining companies, they think they own everything and everyone," Carlos said when Jack finished. "My cousin worked for them for 6 months before he had enough, said they treated the children worse than animals. I'm asking for help, Carlos, not just for Samuel, but for what's right." Carlos was quiet for a moment, considering. "What kind of help are you looking for?" "If trouble comes to my ranch, I might need someone to get word to the territorial marshal. In Phoenix, someone Kane's people wouldn't expect, and if the trouble's more immediate than that," Jack met his friend's eyes directly, "then I might need someone who knows how to handle a rifle and isn't afraid to use it." Carlos nodded slowly. "I'll keep my ears open. And Jack, if you need me, send word. That boy deserves better than what they'd give him back in those mines." The conversation with Carlos had taken longer than expected, and the sun was beginning to set as Jack finally approached his ranch. As he crested the familiar hill that overlooked his property, he felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. 3 horses were tied at his hitching post, and even from a distance he could see they weren't the mounts of friendly visitors. These were the same animals he'd seen in town, carrying Kane and his men. Jack spurred his horse forward, his hand instinctively moving to check the Winchester's position in its scabbard. As he approached the house, he could hear voices from the front porch. Kane's smooth, educated tones contrasting sharply with old Pete's gravelly responses. "Assure you understand our position, Mr. Williams. We're simply here to collect property that belongs to the Copper Crown Mining Company, and I'm sure you understand mine," Pete replied, his voice steady despite his age. "This is private property, and you ain't been invited." Jack dismounted at the edge of the yard, deliberately making noise with his spurs and saddle leather. Kane turned toward him with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Mr. Morrison," Kane said pleasantly, "how good of you to join us. I believe we have some business to discuss." Silas Kane was a man who understood the value of appearances. His clothes were expensive but practical, his boots polished but not ostentatious. He carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way through a combination of money, influence, and carefully applied intimidation. "Kane," Jack said simply, leaving his rifle in its scabbard but keeping his hand near it. "You're on my land without invitation. A simple misunderstanding, I'm sure. I'm here about the boy, Samuel, I believe you call him. There seems to have been some confusion about his legal status." "No confusion on my part. I bought out his contract fair and square." Kane's smile widened slightly. But that's where the situation becomes complicated. You see, the contract you purchased was invalid from the beginning. The boy was placed with us illegally by people who had no right to sign custody papers." Jack felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that we've located the boy's legal guardian, his uncle as it happens. A man named Jeremiah Hartwell, who's been searching for the boy ever since he disappeared from his care nearly a year ago." From inside the house, Jack could hear Maria's voice, low and urgent, undoubtedly keeping Samuel away from the windows. The boy would be listening, though. He was too smart not to understand that his future was being decided on the front porch. "This uncle," Jack said carefully. "Where's he been for the past 8 months, while Samuel was working in your mines?" "Searching, naturally. It's a big territory, Mr. Morrison. People disappear easily." Kane's tone remained conversational, but there was steel underneath. "The point is, he's found the boy now, and he's prepared to assume custody immediately. I'd like to meet this uncle, talk to him face to face." "That can be arranged. In fact, he's quite eager to be reunited with his nephew. But first, we need to collect the boy and return him to his proper guardian." Jack stepped closer to the porch, his boots making solid sounds on the wooden steps. "Samuel stays here until I'm satisfied this uncle is legitimate. You can arrange a meeting in town in front of witnesses." Kane's facade of pleasantness finally began to slip. "Mr. Morrison, I'm trying to handle this situation with courtesy and respect for your emotional attachment to the boy. But let me be clear, we will be leaving here with Samuel tonight, one way or another." "No," Jack said simply, "you won't." The two men flanking Kane shifted slightly, their hands moving closer to their weapons. Old Pete, still standing on the porch, casually rested his hand on the butt of his revolver. "This doesn't have to become unpleasant," Kane said, his voice hardening. "But the boy comes with us. We have the law on our side." "Whose law?" Jack asked. "Sheriff Briggs. The same sheriff who's been taking your money to look the other way while children die in your mines." Kane's composure finally cracked completely. "You're making a very dangerous mistake, Morrison. There are powerful people who have significant investments in the Copper Crown operation, people who don't take kindly to interference. Then they should have thought of that before they started enslaving children." The standoff stretched for several long moments, tension crackling in the desert air like lightning before a storm. Finally, Kane stepped back, gesturing to his men. "This conversation isn't over, Morrison. We'll be back, and next time we won't be quite so diplomatic." As the three men mounted their horses and rode away into the gathering darkness, Jack felt the weight of his Winchester rifle against his back and knew that diplomacy had never really been an option. The war for Samuels. Freedom had begun. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost painting the windows of the ranch house in delicate patterns that reminded Jack of Eleanor's lace curtains. He found Samuel already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with one of Thomas's old primers open before him, carefully forming letters on a piece of brown paper with a stub of pencil. "Morning, son," Jack said, settling into his chair with a cup of Maria's strong coffee. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep much," Samuel admitted, not looking up from his writing. "Kept thinking about those men last night." Jack studied the boys. Careful penmanship, noting how much his handwriting had improved over the past weeks. The letters were still uneven, formed with the deliberate concentration of someone new to the skill, but they were legible and growing more confident with each line. "What are you working on there?" Samuel held up the paper, revealing the words, "My name is Samuel Morrison," written in careful script. Below it, he had practiced Samuel Morrison in increasingly fluid versions, as if testing how the name felt on paper. "I know I'm not really your son by blood," Samuel said quietly, "but I was hoping, that is, if you wouldn't mind." Jack felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I'd be honored to have you carry the Morrison name, Samuel. More honored than you know." The boy's face lit up with a smile that transformed his entire appearance, erasing years of hardship and fear in an instant. "Really? You mean it?" "I mean it. In fact, I had Mr. Ashford draw up the adoption papers yesterday. Soon as we get everything legal and proper, you'll be Samuel Morrison in the eyes of the law." Maria appeared from the pantry, with her arms full of preserving jars, having overheard the conversation. "Ay, Dios mío," she said, setting down her burden to embrace Samuel. "My little boy, finally getting the family he deserves." "Now don't go getting all weepy on us, Maria," old Pete said gruffly as he entered through the kitchen door, though his own eyes were suspiciously bright. "We got work to do, and the day's burning already." Over breakfast, Jack outlined his plans for the day. He needed to ride to the neighboring ranches, quietly letting his friends know about the situation and gauging their willingness to stand with him if trouble came. Samuel would stay close to the house, working with Maria in the garden and helping with the livestock that grazed near the barn. "I don't like leaving you here," Jack said, checking his rifle before saddling his horse. "But I need to know where our allies stand." "We'll be fine, Pa," Samuel said with a confidence that both pleased and worried Jack. "Besides, old Pete's scarier than those men any day." Pete chuckled at that, patting the Colt revolver on his hip. "Damn right I am, boy. Fought Apaches and outlaws for more years than you've been alive. Some fancy-dressed mining boss don't worry me none." The first stop was the Garrett spread, where Tom Garrett ran a modest cattle operation with his 2 grown sons. The family had been in the territory for 20 years, and Tom's reputation for honesty had earned him respect throughout the region. "Jack," Tom said, emerging from his barn as Jack approached. "Heard you had some visitors yesterday. Word's already spreading." "Bad news travels fast," Jack replied, dismounting. "I'm hoping good neighbors might travel just as quick when needed." They talked for nearly an hour, Tom asking pointed questions about Samuel's situation and the legal complications Kane had mentioned. When Jack finished explaining, Tom was quiet for several minutes, considering. "That boy's had a hard life," Tom finally said. "No child deserves what they put him through in those mines. You can count on me and my sons if it comes to trouble." The conversations at the next 3 ranches followed similar patterns. The territory's ranches formed a tight-knit community, bound together by shared hardships and mutual dependence. Child labor in the mines was an open secret that had troubled many of them, but individual action had seemed impossible against the mining company's wealth and political connections. Jack's rescue of Samuel had given them a focus for their anger, and, one by one, they pledged their support. By afternoon, he had commitments from 12 men, all experienced with firearms and none willing to see a child return to slavery. The ride home took him past the small schoolhouse where Miss Catherine Palmer taught the children of rancher families. She was standing in the doorway ringing the bell to call her students back from their lunch break when she spotted Jack and waved him over. "Mr. Morrison," she said warmly, "I've been hoping to speak with you about Samuel. Several of the other families have mentioned that you're caring for a boy now." That's right, Miss Palmer. He's a bright child, eager to learn. Would you consider enrolling him in school? I know his education has been interrupted, but I believe I could help him catch up quickly. Jack considered the offer carefully. Under normal circumstances, he would have jumped at the chance to give Samuel a proper education. But with Kane's threats hanging over them, the schoolhouse might not be the safest place for the boy. I appreciate the offer, Jack said finally. Let me get some other matters settled first, then we'll talk about schooling. Miss Palmer's expression suggested she understood more about those other matters than she was letting on. Of course. But Mr. Morrison, please remember that education is a powerful weapon against those who would exploit children. The more Samuel learns, the better equipped he'll be to protect himself. The wisdom in her words stayed with Jack as he rode home, and he found himself thinking about the future he wanted to build for Samuel. Not just safety from immediate threats, but the tools and knowledge the boy would need to build his own life. He arrived at the ranch to find Samuel in the corral with old Pete, learning to work with a rope. The boy's initial attempts at lasso work were clumsy, but he showed the same determined concentration he brought to everything else. Keep your wrist. Steady, son, Pete was saying. The rope's got to know who's boss, but you can't muscle it. It's about timing and feel. Samuel nodded seriously, coiling the rope again and preparing for another attempt. This time, his loop settled neatly over the fence post he'd been aiming for, and he let out a whoop of triumph. Well done, Jack called out, dismounting at the corral fence. Looks like you're getting the hang of it. Old Pete says, I got natural hands for rope work, Samuel said proudly. Says it just takes practice. Everything worth doing takes practice, Jack agreed. How would you like to practice reading and writing some more tonight? I brought something back from town for you. From his saddlebags, Jack produced a copy of Robinson Crusoe, its leather binding worn but still intact. Miss Palmer recommended this one. Says it's about a man who builds a new life in a strange place. Samuel accepted the book with the reverence he might have shown a precious jewel. Books had been mythical objects during his time in the mines, things that existed in a world far removed from his daily reality. Now, holding one in his own hands, he felt the weight of possibility. Will you read it with me, Pa? Every night, Jack promised. After supper, we'll sit by the fire and work through it together. That evening, as promised, they settled into chairs by the fireplace while Maria cleared the dinner dishes and old Pete smoked his pipe on the porch. Samuel opened the book carefully, running his finger along the first line as he slowly worked. Through the words, I was born in the year 1632 in the city of York. Samuel read haltingly, stopping frequently to sound out unfamiliar words. Jack helped when needed, but mostly he just listened, marveling at the boy's determination to master each sentence. There was something deeply satisfying about this simple domestic scene. The crackling fire, the lamplight on the open book, the quiet concentration of a child learning to read. It reminded him of evenings with Thomas, though those memories, longer brought only pain. Instead, they seemed to blend with the present moment, creating something new and healing. This Crusoe fellow, Samuel said during a pause, he lost everything and had to start over, didn't he? That's right, but he didn't give up. He built a new life with his own hands. Samuel considered this, his finger still marking his place in the book. Like us, sort of, building something new. Exactly like us, Jack agreed. Outside, a coyote called to its pack somewhere in the darkness beyond the ranch buildings. The sound was wild and lonely, a reminder that civilization remained a fragile thing in this vast territory. But inside the house, surrounded by books and lamplight and the warmth of family, Samuel Morrison felt safer than he had ever felt in his young life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and Kane's threats still hung over them like storm clouds on the horizon. But tonight, in this moment, a father and son read together by firelight, building something stronger than fear, more permanent than danger. They were building hope. Jack's investigation into the Copper Crown Mining Company began before dawn on a Tuesday morning, when the desert air still held the night's chill and the eastern mountains were painted purple against the lightening sky. He had told Maria and old Pete that he was riding to Phoenix on business, which was true enough, though he hadn't mentioned the specific nature of that business. The territorial capital was a 2-day ride from the ranch, and Jack used the journey to think through what he knew and what he needed to learn. Samuel's fragments of memory, combined with Cain's mention of an uncle, suggested a story more complex than simple child abandonment. If Samuel truly was the heir to a mining fortune, as the boy's occasional glimpses of a better past suggested, then the stakes were far higher than Jack had initially realized. Phoenix in 1885 was a growing town, fueled by railroad money and territorial politics. The streets bustled with activity as Jack guided his horse through the maze of commercial buildings toward the territorial courthouse. His first stop was the records office, where a clerk named Henderson had helped him with land purchases in the past. "Jack Morrison," Henderson said with genuine pleasure as Jack entered the cramped office. "Been a while since we've seen you down here. What brings you to the capital?" "Looking for information about a mining family named Hartwell," Jack said, settling into a chair across from Henderson's desk. "Particularly any records of deaths or estate proceedings from the last few years." Henderson's eyebrows rose slightly, but he was too professional to ask unnecessary questions. "Hartwell, you say? That name's familiar. Let me check the death records first." The search took the better part of an hour, with Henderson pulling bound volumes from shelves and cross-referencing names and dates. Finally, he found what they were looking for. "Here we are," Henderson said, spreading a ledger book across his desk. "Alexander Hartwell and his wife Margaret died in a house fire in November of 1882, left behind one child, a son named Samuel. Alexander Hartwell III, aged 10 at the time of death." Jack felt his heart skip a beat. Samuel would have been 10 in 1882, and the name fit perfectly. "What happened to the boy?" "Let me check the custody records." Henderson pulled another volume and flipped through several pages. According to this, custody was awarded to the deceased man's brother, one Jeremiah Hartwell of Tucson. But that's odd. What's odd? There's a notation here that Jeremiah Hartwell disclaimed custody 6 months later, saying the boy had run away and couldn't be located. But there's no record of any search being conducted, no missing person reports filed. Jack studied the documents carefully, noting the dates and signatures. What about the Hartwell estate? What happened to Alexander's property and money? Henderson's expression grew troubled as he consulted additional records. That's where things get really interesting. Alexander Hartwell owned significant mining interests, including partial ownership of several copper mines. When he died, those interests should have passed to his son, held in trust until the boy came of age. Should have? According to these records, Jeremiah Hartwell, as the boy's guardian, sold off most of the mining interests within 6 months of gaining custody. He claimed it was necessary to pay debts and funeral expenses. Jack felt a cold anger building in his chest. The picture was becoming clear now, and it was uglier than he had imagined. So this Jeremiah fellow gets custody of a wealthy boy, sells off the boy's inheritance, then conveniently reports that the boy has run away. That's certainly one interpretation of the facts, Henderson said carefully, though I should point out that all the transactions appear to have been conducted legally, with proper documentation. Legal doesn't always mean right, Jack observed grimly. The next stop was the Territorial Marshal's office, where Jack hoped to find someone willing to listen to his concerns about corruption in Bisbee. Marshal William Thompson was a career lawman with a reputation for integrity. Though Jack had never met him personally, "Mr. Morrison," Thompson said, rising from behind his desk as Jack was shown into his office. "I've heard good things about your ranch operation. What can I do for you?" Jack explained the situation as thoroughly as possible, from Samuel's rescue to Cain's threats to what he had discovered about the Hartwell family. Thompson listened without interruption, taking notes on a legal pad. "These are serious allegations," Thompson said when Jack finished. "If what you're suggesting is true, we're looking at fraud, embezzlement, and possibly kidnapping charges. What would it take to investigate officially?" "Evidence," Thompson said bluntly. "Right now, you have a theory based on circumstantial information. To build a case, I'd need witnesses, documentation of illegal activity, proof that the boy was taken against his will. The boy himself is a witness to what happened to him. The testimony of a 12-year-old who's been through trauma would be helpful, but it wouldn't be enough by itself, especially if the opposing side can produce documentation showing legal custody arrangements." Jack leaned forward in his chair. "Marshal, while we're building this case, Kane and his people are planning to take Samuel back by force. What can you do to protect him in the meantime?" Thompson was quiet for a moment, considering. "I can't provide protection based on unproven allegations, but I can tell you this. If you believe the boy is in immediate danger, you have the right to defend him. Just make sure you stay within the bounds of the law." The conversation was unsatisfying, but not unexpected. Jack had hoped for more concrete help, but he understood the marshal's position. Without solid evidence, the law's hands were tied. His final stop in Phoenix was at the office of the Territorial Examiner, the capital's largest newspaper. Editor James Morrison, no relation despite the shared name, had built a reputation for investigating corruption and wasn't afraid to take on powerful interests. "This is quite a story," Morrison said after reviewing the documents Jack had copied at the courthouse. "If you're right about this conspiracy, it goes beyond just one boy's welfare. We're talking about systematic exploitation of children, backed by fraudulent legal proceedings. Can you investigate it? I can start asking questions. But I'll need more than what you've given me. Do you think the boy would be willing to talk to a reporter?" Jack considered the question carefully. Samuel had grown more confident over the past months, but asking him to relive his trauma for a newspaper story seemed cruel. On the other hand, publicity might be their best protection against Kane's threats. "Let me talk to him first," Jack said finally. "If he's willing, we could arrange something." The ride back to the ranch gave Jack time to process what he had learned. Samuel wasn't just any orphaned child. He was the heir to a substantial fortune, a fortune that had been stolen from him through legal manipulation and outright fraud. Kane's desperation to reclaim him made perfect sense now. The boy represented not just lost labor, but lost money on a massive scale. Jack arrived home to find an unusual scene on the front porch. Samuel was sitting in Maria's rocking chair, holding what appeared to be a small silver object, while Maria and old Pete looked on with expressions of wonder and concern. "Pa!" Samuel called out as Jack dismounted. "You're back. I found something important." Jack climbed the porch steps and saw that Samuel was holding a small silver locket, tarnished with age but still beautiful. The boy opened it carefully, revealing a tiny photograph inside. "I was cleaning out the room, my room, and this fell out from behind the dresser," Samuel explained. "I think it must have been stuck there all this time." Jack took the locket and studied the photograph inside. It showed a well-dressed man and woman, both with kind faces and clothes that spoke of wealth and education. The man bore a striking resemblance to Samuel, particularly around the eyes. "These are your parents," Jack said softly. It wasn't a question. "I think so," Samuel replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I remember her necklace, the way it caught the light, and his laugh. I can almost hear it when I look at his picture." Maria reached over and gently touched the boy's shoulder. Me Joe, they were beautiful people. You can see the love in their faces." "There's something else," Samuel said, taking the locket back and pointing to the inside of the lid. "There's writing here, but it's so small I can barely make it out." Jack pulled out a magnifying glass he used for reading small print and examined the locket carefully. Engraved in tiny script on the inside of the lid were the words, "To our beloved Samuel Alexander, with all our love. A&M Hartwell, Christmas 1881. The name confirmation hit Jack like a physical blow. Samuel Alexander Hartwell III, the boy, whose fortune had been stolen, whose identity had been erased, whose very existence had been denied by the people who should have protected him. "Samuel," Jack said gently, "I think it's time we had a serious talk about who you really are." That evening, as they sat around the kitchen table with the locket open between them, Jack explained everything he had learned in Phoenix. Samuel listened, with growing amazement and anger as the full scope of the conspiracy against him became clear. "So this uncle, this Jeremiah, he killed my parents?" Samuel asked, his young voice shaking with rage. "We don't know that for certain," Jack said carefully, "but he definitely stole your inheritance and sold you into slavery. That's enough to hang him, if we can prove it." "How do we prove it?" "By being very careful, very smart, and very brave," Jack replied. "By making sure Cain doesn't get his hands on you before we can expose the truth." Samuel picked up the locket and stared at the photograph of his parents. "They look happy," he said quietly, "like they really loved each other. I'm sure they did, and I'm sure they loved you very much. Do you think they'd be proud of me for surviving all this?" Jack felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Son, I think they'd be the proudest parents who ever lived. You've been through hell and come out stronger. That takes courage most adults don't have." Outside, the desert wind whispered through the cottonwood trees, carrying with it the promise of storms to come. But inside the warm kitchen, a family gathered around a silver locket, holding on to love and hope in the face of impossible odds. Samuel Alexander Hartwell III had found his past. Now they had to fight to secure his future. The telegraph office in Bisbee was quiet in the early morning hours when Jack arrived with a carefully composed message for his old friend, Colonel Marcus Webb, in El Paso. Webb had served alongside Jack's father in the Mexican War and later commanded the cavalry unit that had helped establish order in the territory after the Apache campaigns. If anyone could provide reliable military assistance, it would be Webb. The message was brief but urgent. "Need experienced men for protective detail, willing to pay cavalry wages. Situation involves child welfare and mining company corruption. Reply soonest. Jack Morrison." Jack paid the telegraph operator extra to ensure the message went out immediately, then walked across the street to Henderson's Cafe for breakfast, while he waited for a response. The cafe was a popular gathering place for townspeople, and Jack hoped to gauge local sentiment about the growing tension between the Morrison Ranch and the Copper Crown Mining Company. What he heard troubled him deeply. "That Morrison fellow's stirring up a hornet's nest," one merchant was saying to another, over coffee and eggs. "Mining company's been good for business in this town. Lot of jobs, lot of money flowing through." "Still," his companion replied thoughtfully, "what I hear about those children working the mines, that ain't right by any measure." "Right or wrong, it's legal. Paper's been filed proper with the territorial authority. Morrison's just a rancher who's gotten too attached to a boy that ain't his." Jack forced himself to remain calm, sipping his coffee and pretending to read the week-old newspaper while listening to the conversation. It was clear that Cain had been working to shape public opinion, presenting himself as the reasonable party, dealing with an emotional rancher who refused to accept legal realities. The telegraph operator appeared in the cafe doorway and spotted Jack immediately. "Mr. Morrison, got a reply to your message." Jack paid for his breakfast and followed the operator back to the telegraph office, where a return message was waiting. "3 good men departing today. Arrive Bisbee Thursday evening, bringing supplies." Webb. Relief washed over Jack as he read the brief response. Webb was a man of few words, but decisive action. If he was sending 3 men, they would be the kind of veterans who could make a difference in any fight. The ride back to the ranch took Jack past the schoolhouse, where he decided to stop and speak with Miss Palmer about Samuel's education. The conversation with Marshal Thompson had reinforced his belief that knowledge would be crucial to Samuel's long-term protection. "Mr. Morrison," Miss Palmer said warmly as she stepped out to greet him, "I was hoping you'd reconsider bringing Samuel to school. Actually, that's why I'm here. But the situation's more complicated than I originally thought. Jack explained about Samuel's true identity and the legal challenges they faced. I'm wondering if you might consider private tutoring, at least until we get these other matters resolved. Miss Palmer's expression grew increasingly serious as Jack outlined the scope of the conspiracy against Samuel. That poor child, to lose his parents and then be betrayed by family. She paused, considering. Mr. Morrison, I'd be honored to help educate Samuel, but I think we should aim higher than basic tutoring. What do you mean? If Samuel is truly the heir to the Hartwell fortune, he'll need more than elementary education. He'll need to understand business, law, finance, all the tools he'll need to reclaim and manage his inheritance. Jack felt a surge of gratitude toward this dedicated teacher. Would you be willing to develop that kind of curriculum? I have contacts at the Territorial University in Tucson. I could arrange for advanced materials, perhaps even correspondence. E-courses. Miss Palmer's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of an educator presented with an exceptional student. Samuel strikes me as quite intelligent. With proper instruction, there's no limit to what he might achieve. They spent another hour discussing educational plans and scheduling. Miss Palmer would begin visiting the ranch 3 times a week, bringing books and materials appropriate for Samuel's current level while gradually introducing more advanced concepts. The lessons would take place in Jack's study, surrounded by Eleanor's books and the atmosphere of learning she had cultivated. Jack arrived home to find Samuel in the barn with old Pete, learning to properly care for horses. The boy had progressed from simply brushing the animals to understanding their individual personalities and needs. Buttercup, the gentle mare he'd first learned to ride, nuzzled his shoulder affectionately as he worked. "Pa!" Samuel called out when he spotted Jack. "Old Pete's teaching me about horse doctoring. Did you know you can tell if a horse is sick just by looking at its eyes?" "Old Pete knows more about horses than most people know about people," Jack replied, dismounting and leading his horse into the barn. "What else did you learn today?" "Well," Samuel said seriously, "Buttercup here's got a loose shoe on her left front hoof. We need to get the blacksmith out to fix it before she goes lame, and Thunder's been favoring his right side a little. Pete thinks he might have strained something in the pasture." Jack was impressed by the boy's attention to detail and his obvious care for the animals. "Sounds like you're becoming quite the horseman." "It's different from the mines," Samuel said quietly. "There, everything was about making the machines work, no matter what. Here, it's about taking care of living things, making sure they're healthy and happy." Old Pete nodded approvingly. "Boy's got natural instincts for animals. They trust him, and that's something you can't teach." That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Jack shared the news about Colonel Webb's expected arrival and Miss Palmer's educational plans. Samuel's eyes lit up at the mention of advanced schooling. "You really think I could learn business and law?" he asked eagerly. "I think you could learn anything you set your mind to," Jack replied, "but it won't be easy. Advanced education requires discipline and hard work." "I'm not afraid of hard work," Samuel said with quiet determination. "I just want to make sure I'm worthy of all this, of the family name I'm taking, of what my real parents would have wanted for me." Maria reached across the table and took the boy's hand. "Mijo, you are already worthy. You have survived things that would break grown men. You have shown courage and kindness even after experiencing cruelty. Your parents, both your birth parents and your Papa Jack, would be proud of the young man. You are becoming." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Jack immediately tensed, his hand moving instinctively toward his rifle, but old Pete was already at the window. "2 riders," Pete reported, "coming in slow and easy. Don't look hostile." Jack moved to the window and recognized Carlos Mendoza and another rancher named Bill Patterson. Both men were part of the informal alliance Jack had been building, and their presence at this hour suggested urgent news. "Jack," Carlos called out as he dismounted, "we need to talk. Had some visitors today asking questions about you and the boy." The four men gathered on the front porch, while Maria kept Samuel inside, ostensibly helping with the dishes, but actually ensuring he was away from the conversation. Carlos explained that two men claiming to be territorial marshals had visited several ranches, asking about Jack's character and his fitness to care for a child. "Thing is," Bill Patterson added, "their badges looked real enough, but something felt off about them. Too interested in the boy's daily routine, where he goes when he's alone." "Fake marshals," Jack said grimly. "Kane's trying a different approach." "That's what we figured," Carlos agreed, "but it gets worse. They were asking about the layout of your ranch, where the buildings are, how many hands you employ. That's not the kind of information marshals would need for a custody investigation." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. They're planning something, probably waiting for Webb's men to arrive before they make their move. "Speaking of which," Bill said, "you might want to know that Kane's hired himself quite a few new employees recently. Word is he's got at least 15 men working security for the mining company now." The implications were clear. Kane was preparing for war, assembling a private army to overwhelm any resistance Jack might offer. 15 experienced gunmen against Jack, Old Pete, and whatever help Webb could provide seemed like impossible odds. "There's something else," Carlos said quietly. "Sheriff Briggs posted a notice today. Says there's been complaints about unlawful assembly and potential violence at your ranch. He's given himself authority to conduct preventive arrests if he deems it necessary." Jack understood immediately. If Webb's men arrived openly at the ranch, Briggs could arrest them for conspiracy or weapons charges, eliminating Jack's military support before any confrontation with Kane's forces. "We need to be smarter about this," Jack said after a moment's thought. "Carlos, can you meet Webb's men when they arrive in town? Bring them to your place first. Keep them out of sight until we're ready." "Of course. But Jack, what's your plan? Even with military help, we're outnumbered." Jack was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the dark desert beyond his ranch buildings. Somewhere out there, powerful men were planning to destroy everything he'd built, to drag Samuel back into slavery and silence him forever. The stakes couldn't be higher, and conventional resistance seemed doomed to fail. "Sometimes," Jack said finally, "being outnumbered can be an advantage. Makes the enemy overconfident, careless. They'll come expecting to overwhelm us with force, but they won't be prepared for intelligence and planning." "What do you mean?" Jack's expression hardened with resolve. "I mean we're going to make them come to us, on our terms, on ground we choose, and when they do, we're going to be ready for them." Inside the house, Samuel was helping Maria wash the dinner dishes when he heard the serious tone of the men's voices on the porch. He couldn't make out words, but he could feel the tension in the air, like electricity before a thunderstorm. "Señora Maria," he said quietly, "they're planning to take me back, aren't they?" Maria paused in her washing, her hands still in the soapy water. "Your Papa Jack will not let that happen, mijo. None of us will. But what if there are too many of them? What if somebody gets hurt because of me?" Maria dried her hands and turned to face the boy, her expression serious but kind. "Samuel, listen to me carefully. Family is not just about blood. It is about choice. Your Papa Jack chose you, just as you chose him. Old Pete chose to stay and help protect you. I chose to make this house your home. When family chooses to stand together, they become stronger than any force that stands against them." Samuel nodded, understanding more than his years should have allowed. "I won't run away. If they come for me, I'll stand and fight too. I know you will, mijo. But remember, sometimes the greatest courage is knowing when to let others protect you so you can live to fight another day." Outside, the desert wind carried the scent of distant rain and the promise of storms to come. But inside the Morrison ranch house, a family prepared to face whatever darkness approached, bound together by love, stronger than blood, and courage, deeper than fear. The final confrontation was coming, and everyone could feel it in the air. The quiet moments just before dawn had always been Jack's favorite time at the ranch. The desert held its breath in those precious minutes between night and day, when the air was cool and still, and the first light painted the eastern mountains in shades of gold and rose. It was during one of these peaceful interludes, 3 days after Carlos's warning about the fake marshals, that Samuel made the discovery that would change everything. Jack was in the barn, checking on Thunder's strained leg, when he heard Samuel calling his name with unusual urgency. The boy's voice carried a note of excitement, mixed with something that might have been fear, and Jack immediately dropped what he was doing to respond. He found Samuel in the study, standing beside Eleanor's writing desk with the small silver locket in his hands. The boy had been carrying it with him everywhere since finding it, drawing comfort from the connection to his lost parents. But now his face was pale with shock, and his hands trembled slightly as he held the precious keepsake. "Pa," Samuel said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I found something else. Something hidden." Jack approached carefully, recognizing the signs of a child on the edge of emotional overload. "What did you find, son?" "I was looking at the locket again, trying to remember more about my parents when I noticed something strange." Samuel's fingers worked carefully at the back of the locket, and Jack saw that there was a tiny mechanism he hadn't noticed before. "There's a secret compartment." With a soft click, a hidden panel slid open, revealing a space barely large enough to hold a folded piece of paper. Samuel extracted the paper with infinite care, his hands shaking as he unfolded what appeared to be a letter written in a woman's delicate script. "It's from my mother," Samuel breathed. "She wrote it for me." Jack settled into a chair beside the boy, sensing that whatever this letter contained would be of monumental importance. "Would you like me to read it with you?" Samuel nodded, and together they began to work through the carefully penned words. "My dearest Samuel, if you are reading this letter, then the worst has happened and your father and I are no longer with you. I pray that you are safe, that you are loved, and that you have grown into the remarkable young man I know you will become. There are things you must know about your family, about who you are, and about the danger that may come seeking you. Your father was not simply a mine owner. He was the largest shareholder in a consortium of mining operations throughout the territory. His death, should it come before his time, will make many people very wealthy, but only if you do not survive to inherit what is rightfully yours. The papers hidden in your father's safe detail everything, the true extent of your inheritance, the names of those who might wish you harm, and the evidence of their previous crimes. If something happens to us, these papers will be your only protection and your only hope of reclaiming what belongs to you. Trust no one completely, except those who love you without condition. Your uncle Jeremiah has always been jealous of your father's success, and I fear what he might do if given the opportunity. There are others too, partners in the business who have shown their true nature when money is concerned. You are worth more than they know, my darling boy. Not just in money, but in spirit, in intelligence, in the capacity for love and goodness that shines from your eyes. Whatever happens, remember that you are loved beyond measure, and that love will guide you home. The key to your father's safe is hidden where only you would think to look, behind the loose stone in the fireplace of your nursery, the one you used to hide your treasures when you were small. Inside the safe, you will find not just papers, but also a letter from your father explaining everything. Be brave, my sweet Samuel. Be smart, be kind, and know that wherever we are watching over you with all the love in our hearts, forever. Your mother, Margaret Hartwell. The letter ended with a postscript that made Jack's blood run cold. If you suspect you are in danger, there is one man who can be trusted completely. Judge Harrison Vale in Phoenix. He was your father's dearest friend and has sworn to protect you should the need arise. Show him this letter and the contents of the safe, and he will know what to do. Samuel's hands were shaking so violently by the time they finished reading that he could barely hold the letter. Jack gently took it from him and read it again, his mind racing through the implications of what they had discovered. "Pa," Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. She knew. She knew they were going to be killed. It seems like she suspected. Yes," Jack replied carefully. "Your parents were trying to protect you the only way they could. But the safe, she mentions a safe with papers and evidence. Do you think it still exists?" Jack considered the question carefully. If Alexander Hartwell had been as wealthy and influential as the letter suggested, his house would have been substantial, built to last. Even if it had burned, as the official records indicated, a safe might have survived. "There's only one way to find out," Jack said finally. "We need to go to your family's old house and see what's left. Is that safe? With Kane's people watching us? We'll make it safe," Jack promised. "But Samuel, if what your mother wrote is true, those papers could be the key to everything. They could prove who really killed your parents, who stole your inheritance, and who's been behind the conspiracy to keep you enslaved." The decision to investigate the Hartwell property was not made lightly. Jack spent the rest of that day planning. The expedition with old Pete and Carlos, who had arrived to help with the ranch work and stayed to discuss strategy. "The old Hartwell place is about 15 miles north of Tucson," Carlos said, studying a hand-drawn map. "I remember when it burned, big news throughout the territory, but I heard rumors that not everything was destroyed." "What kind of rumors?" Jack asked. "Some folks said the fire was set deliberately, but that whoever did it didn't stick around long enough to make sure everything burned completely. The stone foundation and basement were still intact when the authorities finally got there." Old Pete nodded thoughtfully. "Stone foundation means there could have been a stone-walled basement. Good place for a safe, if a man was thinking about security." They decided to make the journey in 2 days, giving Jack time to arrange for the ranch's protection in their absence. Colonel Webb's men had arrived as promised and were staying at Carlos's ranch, ready to move to the Morrison place if trouble developed. Maria would remain at the ranch with one of Webb's sergeants, a steady man named Cooper who had served with distinction in the Indian campaigns. The night before their departure, Samuel sat in his room, Thomas's room, staring at the letter, and the locket that had revealed so many secrets. The weight of his true identity was beginning to settle on his shoulders, and he found himself struggling with emotions he couldn't quite name. Jack found him there an hour after supper, sitting by the window and looking out at the star-filled desert sky. "Having second thoughts about tomorrow?" Jack asked gently. "No," Samuel replied, though his voice carried uncertainty. "It's just, what if we find those papers and they prove everything my mother wrote? What if I really am worth all that money? Would that change how you feel about being here? About being part of this family?" Samuel turned to look at Jack, his young face serious beyond his years. "I don't want to be rich if it means losing you. The Morrison Ranch is the first real home I've ever known. You're the first father I can remember. I don't want money or mining companies. I just want to stay here." Jack felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Son, no amount of money in the world could take you away from this family. If those papers prove your inheritance, we'll use it to make sure you're safe and to help other children who are trapped like you were. But this will always be your home, and I will always be your father. Promise?" "I promise. Whatever we find tomorrow, whatever battles we have to fight, we face them together. The Morrison family stands together." Samuel nodded, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "Then let's go find those papers. Let's find out who I really am." Outside, a night wind whispered across the desert, carrying with it the scent of distant places and the promise of revelations to come. In a few hours, they would begin a journey that would either vindicate Margaret Hartwell's desperate efforts to protect her son or lead them into greater danger than they had yet faced. But for now, a father and son sat together in the lamplight, bound by love and determination, preparing to uncover secrets that had been buried for 3 long years. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it as a family, The truth was waiting, hidden in stone and shadow, and Samuel Alexander Hartwell III was finally ready to claim it. The ride to the ruins of the Hartwell estate began before dawn, with Jack, Samuel, and old Pete moving through the desert darkness like shadows. They had chosen this route deliberately, a winding path through arroyos and behind mesa formations that would keep them hidden from any watchers Kane might have posted along the main roads. Colonel Webb's 3 men had arrived at the Morrison ranch just as Jack's party departed, their presence ensuring that Maria would be protected and that any assault on the ranch would meet organized resistance. Sergeant Cooper, a weathered veteran with steel-gray eyes, had shaken Jack's hand with the firm grip of a man who understood the stakes. "We'll hold the fort, Mr. Morrison," Cooper had said simply. "You just worry about finding what you need to find." The journey took them through some of the most beautiful and treacherous country in the territory. Red rock canyons gave way to rolling hills covered with sage and mesquite, while overhead the stars gradually faded as the eastern sky began to lighten. Samuel rode Buttercup with growing confidence, his horsemanship improving dramatically over the past weeks under old Pete's patient instruction. "Tell me about the house," Jack said, as they paused to rest the horses beside a small stream. "What do you remember about where you lived before?" Samuel closed his eyes, concentrating on memories that had been buried under months of trauma and survival. "It was big," he said slowly. "Stone walls, thick like a fortress. My father said it was built to last forever. There were gardens and a fountain in the courtyard that made music when the wind blew through it." "What about inside? Do you remember the layout?" "The nursery was on the 2nd floor, overlooking the garden. The fireplace had stones that came from a riverbed. My mother told me that. Some of them were different colors, and one of them was a loose. I used to hide things behind it." Old Pete nodded approvingly. "Good memory, boy. If that stone's still there, and if the safe's where your ma said it was, we might just have what we need." They reached the outskirts of the Hartwell property as the sun climbed toward its zenith. Jack called a halt at the edge of a grove of cottonwood trees, using his field glasses to survey the ruins that lay spread before them across a shallow valley. The devastation was more complete than Jack had expected. The main house had indeed burned to its stone foundation, leaving only blackened walls and empty window frames like dead eyes staring across the desert. Outbuildings had fared better. A barn, a stable, and what looked like servant quarters showed damage, but remained partially intact. "Jesus," old Pete breathed, lowering his own field glasses. Somebody really wanted to make sure nothing survived. But as they studied the ruins more carefully, Jack began to see signs that gave him hope. The stone foundation was indeed massive, and what appeared to be basement walls extended below ground level. If Alexander Hartwell had built a safe room or vault in that basement, it might have survived even a deliberately set fire. "Samuel," Jack said quietly, "are you ready for this? Seeing your family's home like this, it's going to be hard." The boy's face was pale, but determined. "I need to see it, Pa. I need to know what happened here." They approached the ruins carefully, old Pete scouting ahead while Jack and Samuel followed at a distance. There were no signs of recent visitors, but the silence felt oppressive, as if the very air held memories of violence and loss. Standing in what had once been the main hallway, Samuel seemed to shrink into himself, overwhelmed by the ghosts of his past. The walls that remained showed evidence of a once grand home, carved stone details, the remnants of fine wallpaper, fragments of what had been elegant fixtures. "The staircase was here," Samuel said softly, pointing to a pile of charred timber. "It curved up to the 2nd floor, and my mother would stand at the top sometimes, calling me in for dinner." Jack placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "We don't have to do this if it's too much." "No," Samuel said, his voice growing stronger. "I need to remember. For them." They found the entrance to the basement behind what had been the kitchen, a stone stairway that descended into darkness. Old Pete lit a lantern he'd brought for this purpose, and the flickering light revealed a space that had indeed survived the fire, largely intact. The basement was larger than expected, with several rooms that had apparently served different purposes. One room showed evidence of having been a wine cellar, its stone walls still holding the brackets where racks had once been mounted. Another appeared to have been used for storage, with the remnants of wooden shelves and barrels scattered across the floor. But it was the third room that caught their attention. Unlike the others, this space had been deliberately constructed for security, with thicker walls and what appeared to be the remains of a heavy door that had been forced open and destroyed. "This is it," Jack said, raising the lantern to examine the walls more closely. This was your father's safe room. The room had been thoroughly ransacked. Papers were scattered everywhere, some burned, others simply destroyed by time and moisture. Furniture had been overturned and smashed, and it was clear that whoever had searched this place had been both thorough and desperate. But in the far corner, built into the stone wall itself, stood a massive iron safe. Its door hung open, and its interior appeared to be empty, but the safe itself was intact. "They got here first," old Pete said grimly, examining the scattered papers. "Looks like they found what they were looking for." Samuel's face fell with disappointment, but Jack wasn't ready to give up. "Your mother said the key was hidden behind a loose stone in your nursery fireplace. Maybe they didn't find everything." The climb to the second floor was treacherous, with burned timbers and unstable flooring making every step dangerous. But Samuel's memory proved accurate. The nursery was exactly where he had said it would be, and remarkably, a portion of the fireplace had survived the blaze. "There," Samuel said, pointing to a stone near the base of the fireplace that was slightly different in color from the others. "That's the one." Working together, they managed to pry the stone loose, revealing a small cavity behind it. Jack reached inside and felt his fingers close around something metallic, a key, just as Margaret Hartwell had promised. But there was something else in the hiding place, something his mother had never mentioned in her letter. Wrapped in oiled cloth was another, smaller document that had been protected from both fire and moisture. "It's a deed," Jack said, unfolding the paper carefully. "To a mining claim. The Esperanza mine. And it's not just a claim, it's a fully operational mine that your father apparently owned outright." Samuel stared at the document in amazement. "But Kane said all the mining interests were sold. He said Uncle Jeremiah disposed of everything. This mine wasn't part of the consortium. Your father owned it personally, separate from his other business interests." Jack studied the deed more carefully. "And according to this, it's been producing steadily for the past 3 years. Someone's been operating it and collecting the profits." Old Pete whistled low. "Boy, you might be richer than we thought." But the discovery raised more questions than it answered. If the Esperanza mine was still operating, who was running it? And more importantly, who was collecting the money it generated? The journey back to the ranch was made with a sense of urgency that hadn't been present on the outward trip. The discovery of the mine deed changed everything, providing not just evidence of Samuel's rightful inheritance, but also a potential source of the funds that had been financing Kane's operations. As they rode through the gathering dusk, Jack's mind was already working on their next moves. The deed needed to be authenticated and registered properly. Judge Vale needed to be contacted immediately, and most importantly, they needed to find out exactly who had been stealing from the Esperanza mine for the past 3 years. But first, they needed to get home safely, and Jack was becoming increasingly concerned about the lack of activity they'd encountered. In his experience, when an operation like Kane's went quiet, it usually meant they were preparing for something big. His fears proved justified when they crested the hill overlooking the Morrison Ranch. Even in the fading light, Jack could see that something was wrong. There were too many horses at the main house, and the glow of what appeared to be torches or lanterns suggested a larger gathering than the household should have contained. "Pa," Samuel said quietly, his voice tight with fear, "is that our ranch?" Jack raised his field glasses and felt his blood turn to ice. Kane's men had indeed come, but not as raiders. They had come as an occupying force. At least 20 armed men were visible around the ranch buildings, and more might be hidden from view, but what chilled Jack to the bone was the sight of a familiar figure standing on the front porch, clearly visible in the lamplight. Sheriff Briggs was there, and he was clearly working with Kane rather than maintaining any pretense of law enforcement. "They're not attacking," old Pete observed grimly. "They're waiting." But waiting for what? The answer came in the form of a white flag tied to a fence post near the main gate, a signal that someone wanted to parley. Jack had seen similar arrangements during his father's military service, and the message was clear: come talk or face the consequences. As they watched from their concealed position, a lone rider emerged from the group around the house and began moving in their direction. Even at a distance, Jack could tell it was Kane himself, come to deliver his ultimatum in person. "What do we do, Pa?" Samuel asked, his young voice steady despite the fear Jack knew he must be feeling. Jack looked down at the boy, his boy, and felt a surge of protective fury that surprised him with its intensity. They had come so far, discovered so much, and now Kane was trying to end it all with a show of overwhelming force. But Jack Morrison hadn't built the largest ranch in 3 counties by backing down from bullies, and he wasn't about to start now. "We go talk to him," Jack said finally, "but we do it on our terms." The final confrontation was about to begin, and everyone involved knew that only one side would walk away from it intact. The question was whether justice and love would prove stronger than money and corruption. In a few minutes, Jack would have his answer. The ranch bell that had called the Morrison family to meals for 15 years now served a different purpose. As Jack pulled its rope 3 times in the prearranged signal, the deep bronze tone echoed across the desert, carrying a message that every man positioned around the ranch buildings would understand. The battle was about to begin. Kane had chosen his timing well, arriving with overwhelming force, while Jack's party was away, but he had underestimated both the loyalty of Jack's allies and the tactical preparations that had been put in place. Sergeant Cooper and his 2 companions had not simply waited at the ranch house, they had transformed the entire property into a defensive position. From his concealed position on the hill overlooking his home, Jack could see the fruits of their preparation. The barn had been turned into a fortress, with rifle ports cut through the walls and hay bales stacked to provide additional protection. The main house showed similar modifications, with boards nailed across windows and defensive positions established on the porch and upper floors. Most importantly, Kane's forces had been allowed to establish themselves in what they thought was a position of strength, but which was actually a carefully prepared killing field. Every approach to the ranch buildings was covered by crossfire from multiple positions, and escape routes had been deliberately left open to channel any retreat in directions that would expose Kane's men to additional ambush points. "Clever," old Pete observed as he studied the tactical situation through his field glasses. "Cooper's boys have turned your ranch into a damn fortress." "But they're still outnumbered at least 2 to 1, Jack replied grimly. "And Kane's got Sheriff Briggs with him, which means he can claim legal authority for whatever he does." Samuel had been unusually quiet during their reconnaissance, but now he spoke up with a determination that reminded Jack powerfully of the boy's father. "Pa, I have an idea. What if I surrender myself to them?" "Absolutely not," Jack said immediately. "Hear me out," Samuel continued urgently. "They want me alive. You're playing a dangerous game, Morrison. There are forces at work here that you don't understand, money and influence that can destroy you even if you win this particular fight. Then maybe it's time those forces were brought into the light," Jack said. "Maybe it's time people learned exactly what the Copper Crown Mining Company has been doing to children in this territory." The standoff stretched for several long moments, tension crackling between the 2 men like lightning. Finally, Kane pulled out a pocket watch and consulted it with theatrical precision. "I'm a reasonable man, Morrison. I'll give you 30 minutes to reconsider your position, Bring the boy down here, and we can end this without bloodshed. Refuse, and I'll be forced to take more direct action. And if I refuse—" Kane's smile was genuinely frightening. "Then you'll discover just how much influence the Copper Crown Mining Company has with territorial law enforcement. Sheriff Briggs has warrants for your arrest on charges of kidnapping, unlawful detention of a minor, and conspiracy to defraud. Your friends up there will have a choice: surrender peacefully or be charged as accomplices." The legal maneuvering was clever, Jack had to admit. Even if his forces won the immediate battle, Kane could use the law to destroy him afterward. "Unless—" "Those are serious charges," Jack said carefully. "I assume you have evidence to support them?" "All the evidence we need. Signed affidavits, documentation of the boy's legal status, testimony from witnesses who will swear you took him by force." "Interesting, because I have some documentation of my own. Evidence that might call into question who the real criminals are in this situation." For the first time, Kane looked genuinely uncertain. What kind of evidence? Jack had been waiting for this moment. The chance to throw Kane's confidence back in his face. The kind that proves Samuel isn't just any orphaned boy. The kind that shows exactly who's been stealing from the Esperanza mine for the past 3 years. Kane's face went white. "That's impossible. The Esperanza property was what? Sold? Transferred? Or just quietly taken over by people who thought no one would ever ask questions?" The mining supervisor's composure finally cracked completely. His hand moved instinctively toward his gun, and Jack tensed for the violence he knew was coming. But the shot, when it came, didn't come from Kane's weapon. Instead, a rifle cracked from the direction of the hills, and dust kicked up just inches from Kane's horse's hooves. Old Pete's voice carried clearly across the desert air. "I wouldn't, if I were you." Kane's hand froze halfway to his holster, and Jack could see the man's mind racing through options that were rapidly disappearing. 30 minutes, you said," Jack observed calmly. "I'll give you 5 to get your men off my property. After that, anyone still here gets treated as a trespasser." "This isn't over, Morrison." "No," Jack agreed. "It's not, but it's about to be." As Kane wheeled his horse around and spurred back toward the ranch buildings, Jack felt the weight of inevitability settling on his shoulders. The talking was done. In a few minutes, the shooting would start. And when it did, everything they had built, everything they had fought for, would be decided by fire and blood under the merciless Arizona sun. The battle for the Morrison Ranch began with the sound Jack had been dreading, Samuel's clear young voice calling out across the desert as he rode down from their hiding place. His hands raised in surrender. "Stop!" the boy shouted, his voice carrying remarkable authority for someone so young. "I'm Samuel Hartwell, and I'm giving myself up." Jack's heart stopped as he watched his son, for that's what Samuel truly was now, ride directly into the midst of Kane's forces. Everything they had planned, all their tactical advantages, seemed meaningless in the face of this desperate gambit. "Samuel!" "No!" Jack spurred his horse forward, but Samuel was already within Kane's reach, surrounded by armed men who looked to their leader for orders. Kane's face showed a mixture of triumph and surprise as Samuel dismounted in front of the ranch house. "Well, well, the boy shows more sense than his adopted father." "I'll come with you," Samuel said, his voice steady despite the obvious fear in his eyes. "But only if you let everyone else go unharmed." "Samuel!" Jack had reached the edge of the group, his rifle ready but useless with the boy so close to Kane's men. "Get away from them." "I'm sorry, Pa," Samuel called back, and Jack could hear the tears the boy was fighting to hold back. "But I won't let them hurt you because of me." Kane drew his revolver and pointed it directly at Samuel's head. "How touching. The boy's willing to sacrifice himself for his family. Unfortunately, Mr. Morrison, your son has just made this situation much simpler." The cold calculation in Kane's voice told Jack everything he needed to know. Kane had never intended to let any of them survive this confrontation. Samuel's surrender hadn't bought them safety. It had simply given Kane a hostage. To ensure Jack's compliance, "Here's what's going to happen." Cain continued, his gun never wavering from Samuel's temple. "You're going to order your men to throw down their weapons and surrender. Then you're going to sign a confession stating that you kidnapped this boy and held him against his will. And then," Cain's smile was genuinely evil, "then you're all going to resist arrest. And unfortunately, Sheriff Briggs will be forced to shoot you while defending himself." Jack felt rage boiling in his chest, a fury so intense it threatened to overwhelm his tactical thinking. But as he looked at Samuel, brave, selfless Samuel, who had walked into hell to protect the people he loved, Jack found a cold clarity that surprised him. "You're making one mistake, Cain," Jack said quietly. "And what's that?" "You're assuming I raised a helpless child." Samuel's eyes met Jack's across the space between them, and in that instant Jack saw understanding pass between them. The boy's right hand, hanging casually at his side, moved slightly to touch the heavy brass buckle of his belt, the belt that old Pete had specially modified with a hidden knife. "Pa," Samuel said clearly, "I love you. I love you too, son. Now, show them what the Morrison family is made of." Samuel moved with the lightning speed that months of ranch work had given him. The knife appeared in his hand as if by magic, and he drove it deep into Cain's thigh, causing the man to scream and stumble backward. At the same instant, Samuel dropped to the ground and rolled toward the porch, creating the opening Jack needed. Jack's Winchester spoke first, dropping the man nearest to Samuel. Old Pete's rifle cracked from the hills, taking down another of Cain's gunmen. Suddenly, the carefully planned ambush erupted into chaos as Sergeant Cooper and his men opened fire. From the barn and house, Cain's superior numbers meant nothing when his men were caught in crossfire from multiple directions. The killing field that Cooper had prepared worked exactly as intended, channeling Cain's forces into positions where they could be cut down by concentrated fire from concealed positions. But Cain himself, wounded and furious, was far from finished. Ignoring the blood streaming from his leg, he lurched towards Samuel with his revolver raised. "You little bastard! I'll kill you myself." Jack threw himself from his horse, tackling Cain just as the man's gun fired. The bullet went wide, but Cain was stronger than his wound suggested, and the two men rolled across the dusty ground in desperate combat. Cain managed to get his hands around Jack's throat, pressing with the strength of desperation and fury. Black spots began to dance at the edges of Jack's vision as his air supply was cut off. But then Samuel was there. The Morrison Ranch brand, a heavy iron used for marking cattle, in his small hands. He brought it down on Cain's skull with all the force he could muster, and the mining supervisor collapsed like a felled tree. Pa, are you all right?" Jack struggled to his feet, his throat burning but his breathing restored. Around them, the battle was winding down as Cain's surviving men either fled into the desert or threw down their weapons in surrender. Sheriff Briggs, who had tried to slip away during the fighting, found himself facing Sergeant Cooper's service. Revolver. The corrupt lawman's hands shook as he raised them in surrender. "It's over," Jack said, pulling Samuel into a fierce embrace. "It's finally over." But even as he spoke the words, Jack knew they weren't entirely true. Cain was defeated, and the immediate threat to Samuel was ended. But the larger conspiracy, the theft of the Esperanza mine, the murder of Samuel's parents, the systematic exploitation of children throughout the territory, all of that still needed to be exposed and punished. As the sun set over the Morrison Ranch, painting the desert in shades of gold and red, a father and son stood together amid the aftermath of battle. They had defended their home, their family, and their future. But more than that, they had proven that love and determination could triumph over greed and corruption. The boy who had entered the mines as a slave had emerged as a warrior. The man who had lost one family had fought to protect another, and together they had built something that no amount of money or violence could destroy. The Morrison family had survived its greatest test. 6 months later, The morning sun streamed through the windows of the territorial courthouse in Phoenix as Judge Harrison Vale reviewed the final documents that would complete one of the most complex legal cases in Arizona Territory's history. The courtroom was packed with spectators, journalists, and officials who had come to witness the conclusion of what newspapers had dubbed the Hartwell Affair. At the plaintiff's table sat Samuel Alexander Hartwell Morrison, now 13 years old and bearing the combined names that honored both his birth parents and the man who had saved him. Beside him, Jack Morrison wore his best suit and the quiet pride of a father watching his son reclaim his rightful place in the world. "The court finds," Judge Vale announced in his clear, authoritative voice, "that the minor child, Samuel Alexander Hartwell Morrison, is indeed the sole legal heir to the estate of Alexander and Margaret Hartwell, and that all transactions conducted by Jeremiah Hartwell and his associates regarding said estate were fraudulent and void." A murmur of satisfaction rippled through the courtroom. It had taken months of investigation, testimony from dozens of witnesses, and the careful work of territorial marshals to unravel the full scope of the conspiracy that had stolen Samuel's childhood and fortune. But the truth had finally emerged, documented in legal proceedings that would serve as precedent for future cases. Jeremiah Hartwell sat in shackles at the defendant's table, his face a mask of defeated rage. Beside him, the remnants of Cain's organization awaited sentencing for crimes ranging from fraud to attempted murder. Sheriff Briggs had already been sentenced to 10 years in territorial prison, his career and reputation destroyed by the evidence of his corruption. Cain himself would face no earthly justice. He had died from his injuries 3 days after the battle at the Morrison Ranch, taking many of his secrets with him. But the evidence recovered from his offices and the testimony of his surviving associates had been enough to expose the systematic exploitation that had enriched so many at the cost of so much suffering. Furthermore, Judge Vale continued, the court hereby awards damages in the amount of $47,000 to compensate for profits illegally extracted from the Esperanza mine, plus an additional $15,000 in punitive damages for the pain and suffering inflicted upon the plaintiff. Samuel squeezed Jack's hand under the table. The money was substantial, enough to make him one of the wealthiest young men in the territory. But both of them knew that the real victory was the justice finally served, and the other children who would be protected by the legal precedents being established. Additionally, the judge said, his voice carrying a note of personal satisfaction, the court orders the immediate liberation of all minor children currently held under exploitative labor contracts by the Copper Crown Mining Company and its subsidiaries. The Territorial Marshal's Office will oversee the placement of these children in appropriate homes and educational situations. The courtroom erupted in applause at this announcement. The case had exposed the systematic abuse of dozens of children throughout the territory, and their liberation had become a cause célèbre that had attracted support from as far away as Washington, D.C. After the legal proceedings concluded, Jack and Samuel walked through the streets of Phoenix toward the train station, where they would catch the afternoon train back to Tucson. The publicity surrounding the case had made Samuel something of a celebrity, but he handled the attention with the same quiet dignity that had marked his character from the beginning. "Are you happy with how it turned out?" Jack asked, as they waited on the platform. Samuel considered the question seriously. "I'm glad the other children are free," he said finally. "And I'm glad Uncle Jeremiah and his friends will pay for what they did. But mostly I'm just glad to be going home." "Home to the ranch, you mean?" "Home to our family," Samuel corrected with a smile that transformed his entire face. The train arrived with a great hissing of steam and screeching of brakes, and they settled into their seats for the journey back to Bisbee. As the desert landscape rolled past the windows, Jack reflected on how much had changed since that day. 6 months ago, when he had first walked into the Copper Crown mine, they had fought for Samuel's freedom and won not just his liberty, but justice for dozens of other children. They had exposed corruption that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. They had built something lasting and meaningful from the ashes of tragedy and loss. But more than any of that, they had built a family. The Morrison Ranch came into view as their hired wagon crested the familiar hill, and Samuel let out a whoop of joy at seeing the buildings rebuilt and improved after the battle. Maria had planted new flowers around the house, and old Pete had built additional corrals for the horses Samuel was learning to train. "Welcome home, Micho," Maria called out as they approached, emerging from the kitchen with flour on her apron, and tears of joy in her eyes. "I've been cooking all day for your return." Old Pete appeared from the barn, grinning broadly and wiping his hands on a rag. "About time you got back, boy. These horses don't train themselves, and I'm getting too old to do all the work." That evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table for the first time in months, Jack looked around at the faces illuminated by lamplight and felt a profound sense of completion. Samuel was explaining his plans for using part of his inheritance to establish a school for children rescued from exploitative labor situations. Maria was fussing over everyone's plate, making sure they ate enough of her carefully prepared meal. Old Pete was regaling them with stories of what had happened on the ranch during their absence. It was a scene of domestic harmony that Eleanor would have loved. And for the first time in years, Jack found himself able to think of his first wife without pain. The love he had shared with Eleanor hadn't been diminished by the love he felt for Samuel. Instead, it had been multiplied, expanded, transformed into something even more beautiful. After dinner, they settled into their familiar evening routine. Samuel sat at the kitchen table with his correspondence courses from the Territorial University, working through advanced mathematics with the same determination he had once brought to survival in the mines. Miss Palmer had been right about his intelligence. Given proper instruction, there seemed to be no limit to what he might achieve. Jack sat nearby with his ledger books, managing the business of the ranch and the new foundation Samuel was establishing. The Hartwell-Morrison Foundation for Child Welfare would ensure that no other child in the territory would suffer the kind of exploitation Samuel had endured. As the evening drew to a close, Samuel looked up from his studies and asked the question that had become their nightly ritual. "Pa, will you read with me?" They had long since finished Robinson Crusoe and moved on to more advanced literature. Tonight it was Dickens. Oliver Twist seemed particularly appropriate given their own experiences with corruption and the exploitation of children. "Please, sir, I want some more," Samuel read aloud, his voice clear and confident. The master was a fat, healthy man, but he turned very pale. He gazed in stupefied astonishment on the small rebel for some seconds, and then clung for support to the copper. "What do you think about Oliver's courage in asking for more?" Jack asked. Samuel considered the question thoughtfully. "I think sometimes you have to ask for what you deserve, even when you're scared, even when the people with power don't want to give it to you. Is that what you did, when you decided to surrender yourself to Cain?" "I guess so. I was asking for you to be safe, for our family to survive. I figured that was worth the risk." Jack felt his throat tighten with emotion, as it did every time he thought about Samuel's courage during that terrible confrontation. "You know what? I think..." "What?" "I think you're braver than Oliver Twist ever dreamed of being, and I think your parents, all of them, would be proud of the man you're becoming." Samuel smiled, the same radiant expression that had captured Jack's heart in a dusty mine so many months ago. "I hope so, Pa. I hope I can live up to everything they dreamed for me." Outside, the desert wind whispered through the cottonwood trees, carrying with it the scent of rain and the promise of tomorrow. Inside the Morrison ranch house, a family created not by blood but by choice continued the patient work of building something beautiful from the fragments of broken lives. Samuel Alexander Hartwell. Morrison closed his book and looked around the warm kitchen At the man who had saved him, and the woman who had loved him, and the old cowboy who had taught him to ride. This was his family, and this was his home, and no amount of money or legal documents could make it more real or more precious than it already was. The boy who had once worked in darkness now studied by lamplight, preparing for a future bright with possibility. The man who had once grieved alone now shared his evenings with the son he had chosen, and who had chosen him in return. And in the morning they would wake up together in the house that love had built, ready to face whatever challenges and joys the future might bring. Some stories end with justice served and wrongs made right, but the best stories end with family gathered around a table, with love multiplied rather than divided, with hope for tomorrow burning as bright as the lamp that lights the way home. This was one of those stories,